here with Nick Pilecki, and what we're doing today is going to be matching cameras. Sometimes you don't have the advantage of having all the same color science, as in the same cameras on your shoot. I just did an interview for a feature-length doc with Chris Williamson, the podcaster. Our A cam was the Alexa 35 on a Canon Cine 35 Prime. And then our B cam, well, we had three other cameras. They were all FX6s, but in this case, we're going to be matching the B cam, which was using none other than the Helios 58mm 44-2. I'm never overly concerned about matching lens sets. I think you watch movies like The Favorite and you can see they have all sorts of different lenses. You were telling me earlier today you've been on car commercials where you have an anamorphic for the A cam.
Yeah, and that's pretty common in movies too, where it's almost like what's more like an easier path or least resistance. So a lot of times when you're doing long lens car stuff, especially at night, you'll shoot your actors out with anamorphic and that's the look for the movie. But when it comes down for these specialty shots, it's like, well, you're not going to rig that lens up in a car. You're not going to put it up in the air like that's a drone. And then so when you get into post, you're less worried about like, oh, does the bokeh match perfectly? Are the lens characteristics the same? It's like, no, you're just trying to get your viewer not to leave the world you've created. That's almost the goal of balancing.
Yes.
It's not a pixel to pixel like perfection. It's like, does this keep the person in the world? Yeah,
and there's many times I've matched Alexa to Sony. I find they actually go quite well. In this case, it feels like we have all three major camera manufacturers. We have a Canon lens. We have a...
Which is pretty common on shoots now, because it's more like what fits the budget, what do we have at our disposal, and you can match not even a lower-end camera, but like a camera that's a couple $1,000s to one that could be like $150,000.
On the doc I directed 58 Hours, we always had the Alexa and the FX3, and they worked quite well together. So in this case, Nick is here tinkering away in Resolve. You're just going to do a first quick color pass here on our A cam. Again, this is the Alexa with that 35 Canon Cine Prime. So you're just giving a first quick just Rec 709
Yep.
pass.
So I'll kind of walk through things here, but basically the way I like to work is like you take your favorite footage or your A cam footage, and then you get a look or you get a balance that you're happy with there, and then start working your other cameras to that look.
Yeah.
And then it might turn into a game of like, okay, we have to like go back to the A cam and try to find a median ground to find where they can balance. But like start with the camera that you're like, this is our establishing shot. Let's build the look that we're happy with and then bring the other camera into that world.
And the three main things that we're looking to balance, we were talking about, is that we want skin tone to match. We want white balance, because that's going to be like you can see in here, the table, the counter, the walls. That's going to be our kind of general color balance. And then, of course, contrast ratio.
You want to match like your contrast and your exposure levels first before you go in and start HSLing like a vase in the background. Like that shouldn't be your first thing you're tackling.
Yeah.
Like go to like, okay, contrast and overall exposure look the same.
Yeah.
Now let's worry about white balance. Then let's worry about skin. Like you're almost going down the chain of command until you get notes at the end that are like, oh, that painting in the background, the greens are slightly off, and you're like, okay, well, now we can focus on that. But if you focus on the tiny things first, it's almost impossible to go the other way.
Amazing. Let's get into this.
All right, so with the RE footage here, we've added a color space transform, which is basically just DaVinci's way of doing like a Rec 709 conversion. So we have RE wide gamut 4 and RE log C4. That's the Alexa 35's native color space, and then we transform that to Rec 709 Gamma 2.4. That's kind of right now the universal standard. Whether that changes in the future, I don't know. But right now, that's standard. And then down chain or in front of that node, I have my HDR palette, which is a great way of like doing rough exposure. So it comes free with Resolve, and you can go to and pick your color space. If you go to these three little dots here, and you go down to your gamma, and you just select the camera. So in this case, we're in RE log C4. And then here, this is actually a photometric, meaning it actually is true stop. So if we're looking at the shot and Mark's like, I think it's too bright, can we bring it back one stop?
Yeah.
You can actually go -1, and then that is actually photometrically one stop.
So let's say we had the same lenses. A cam was shooting at a T 2.0 and B cam was at a T 2.8, which is
Then
a
you
one
would
stop.
be one stop.
So I could say, oh, you know, if
Yes.
you had the metadata and we're like, why aren't these looking the same? You could actually look at
Yes.
that and be like, oh, we missed it by a stop.
The way exposure works with f-stops is basically if you start at 1 and 1.4, the difference between a T1 or F1 and a T14 or F14, that's a one-stop difference. And then if you double those numbers down the chain, that's always one-stop difference. So that sounds confusing, but essentially the pattern would go 1, 1, 4, double those, you have 2, 2, 8. The difference between 1 and 1, 4 is a stop. The difference between 1, 4 and 2 is a stop. The difference between 2 and 2, 8 is a stop. And then it goes from a doubling of 2 and 2, 8. Now you're at 4 and 5, 6.
My mind's melting. I kind of just memorized this, but
If you put it up on the bottom,
yeah, here we go on the bottom.
Memorize 1, 1, 4, 2,
I've just always
2, 8,
memorized
4, 5, 6, and then you go up to 8s and 11s. Every time you move one number, that's a one-stop difference in lighting.
Essentially, go look at most lenses. Any of those markings will represent a one stop.
Oh,
that's kind of how I memorized it. So I know 5.6 is this, and then I know and then I know an F8 is a stop.
That's down a stop.
That's down a stop. Yeah.
So you don't have to understand the science behind it, but it's a good thing, especially for communicating with directors, gaffers, anybody on set that like. I think we have to bring it back a stop. If you're at 2s in camera, you have a couple options: either half your ASA or come down to a 2.8 on the lens.
Yeah.
All right, so we're gonna get back to the coloring here. So I have kind of like my high dynamic range or HDR as my first node here, and that's just bringing everything back a stop, because usually when I'm balancing a shot, I'm trying to get like the person looking the way I want them to, because I can always do vignettes, I can select highlights later if windows are bugging me, but once again, we're trying to go big to small. What is the viewer looking at first? Most of the time we look at people first. Make the people look good and then tackle the ancillary problems that are beside the people. So I like where that's sitting. So for primaries, I think I'm gonna pull back my highlights a bit just to kind of like take down this hair light, bring down these windows. So in the primaries tab, I'm just taking my gain and then rolling it back a bit, just so there's like a little bit less spicy on the top end. And then I'm gonna add one more node to kind of like finish off what my primary balance would be. And it's just like the skin's just looking a little reddish to me, and this is just a taste thing. So what I usually do is still down chain in front of my transform. I'm gonna open up my hue versus hue. Underneath your image here, you get kind of options on what tools to use, and I'm gonna pick the qualifier. I'm gonna click on the skin, and then I'm gonna start with kind of swinging that hue onto the skin tone line, which is basically this diagonal line that happens between your red and yellow channels. And I'm gonna take the red, and I'm just gonna swing it so we're just kind of sucking that like magenta out. So it's very subtle, but if we do a before and after, you can kind of see on our vector scope that we're taking those little like red spikes in the skin and just swinging them towards more of like that orangey neutral-ish.
Now that we have our kind of master angle, that's what your A cam is. That's why this is the widest shot. Now let's go match our FX6 from that side angle.
Usually in the process, you want to be matching what is actually going to make it in the cut. So if Mark sends me this is the still where the camera is not completely placed yet, that's probably not a good one to balance to.
No.
And also when you're balancing, so we'll take a shot here. You're going to right click, grab still, and then in your gallery, that'll be saved for when you can do comparisons of your other footage.
So here's the still I've chosen, Nick. Just this is a moment that I probably would cut to this in the edit if he was saying, you know, the dialogue we needed. You can see the 1200 just peeking in from the corner here. We had branches to try to hide the actual light stand for it. And I like that he's framed up here on the brick wall between the windows. And I like this frame also because you're really starting to feel the swirl of the Helios lens. Now we should note, and this is fine, we don't need to do this right now, this will be getting cropped to 235, but we can work with it in the 16:9 world right now.
Perfect. All right, so much similar, like even though we're matching cameras, I always like to know what the manufacturer has kind of said is like, well, this is the best starting place. So we'll see where the LUT's starting. So as you can see, like pretty different.
Yeah.
And if you're ever
I don't like that background.
We can tame that down, don't worry.
Yeah.
But if you're ever questioning like the difference between LUT or color space transforms, you can always like toggle between the two. So Alt S will give you a new node, and under your effects, you can find your color space transform, which is just another way of doing that Rec 709 conversion. So we'd come in here, And for this, you kind of have to know what camera you're shot on, but we know here that we were FX6, so we're going to go with...
Oh, we're Cine. Go back down. We were Cine. Yeah.
There we go. And then...
S-Log3.
S-Log3, and then we're going to push it into that kind of Rec 709 Gamma 2.4 space. All right, so we'll go with this.
Yeah, that's feeling better.
Yeah, so I would go with this, and then so that's kind of our, we're going to balance underneath
CST?
that. Yeah, so that stands for Color Space Transform.
Great.
All right, so similar type thing.
And again, Nick, you always like ending your pipeline with the Rec 709, where some people start with it, but you like to work on everything and then clamp it down to broadcast safe.
So this is a good little learning lesson on why I choose this. If we go to our log, you can almost see in the waveform that like, okay, you know, those highlights are hot, but they haven't clipped past 100 yet. As soon as we go to our conversion, they're right at the top of our waveform. So if we work after our CST, I'm basically saying like this information could be potentially lost.
Yeah.
Where if you work underneath it, I get to manipulate it still without it getting destroyed.
Yeah.
So, but that being said, I know a lot of colorists that'll like do their base look and then they'll start doing creative things after, like pushing teal into the shadows. But like they know that like everything's within the container they're working with. So we're gonna start with, once again, just photometrically, I like the HDR, except this time we're gonna pick S-Log3, and then we're gonna kind of play around with like, we're gonna focus on the person first, and I'm just gonna bring this back a bit. And if we go to our image wipe, which is this guy in the top left corner, we can actually bring in...
Yeah, you can really start to feel the two
the
different
RE3.
worlds.
So the biggest thing I would say is the difference between these two first thing is black level.
That's just the Helios when you're kind of start edging towards that 2 f-stop 2.
Yeah.
It gets really hazy.
Yeah.
It has, and that's kind of the milky, beautiful cinematic look of it. But as you can see, you do lose a lot of the richness in the black. So we're going to have to kind of bring that in without crushing it too much.
And if we were watching this on Netflix, I would say any audience member, no matter how film savvy they are, if these two shots are back to back, they're going to be taken out of whatever the moment is that you're trying to get across.
Yeah.
So
You want people to not notice your editing.
you want people to not notice everything.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. You want them just present in the story.
So we're going to go to primaries, and we're going to kind of like, once again, go from big to small and tackle that black level. So you can do like the waveform side by side also works when you do an image wipe. I usually start just using my eye and be like, does it feel right? Rather than going like, scientifically, is it the exact same
So you're
value?
wiping right now, and down here the waveform is reflecting that, so you can track with that.
Yeah, and you can also do, like, depending on the shot, you can do a vertical wipe. So you can kind of, like, dealer's choice, whatever you're feeling in the moment. So we're going to start with, like, the blacks of the shirt and trying to, like, get that as close as possible. So for that, I'm going to go to my curves and just go to kind of the custom curve section. And we're going to start pulling the black level down. All right, and then so we're going to boost that up, and then I'm going to try to bring this guy down to bring some contrast back in. So you can already see that, like, we're getting much closer to the world.
Immediately, it's like it's even making the shirt feel a bit similar.
Yeah, so skin tones still off, but now if I'm in a watching it space, it's less jarring for me when I'm like, oh, these two are getting cut back to back. Like, at least we're living in the same world. Once again, white balance still different, skin tone's different, but like that contrast ratio is like, oh, it's getting pretty close to what we want to see.
Yeah.
So now I want to start working about highlights, skin tones, white balance. And that doesn't mean we can't come back to our primaries, but I think we're sitting in a good spot to kind of move on to the next thing.
Absolutely.
Because one thing you have to keep in mind with color is that everything affects itself. So when we change the white balance, like, you might have to go back and adjust your contrast. Like, it's okay to go back after. It's like rewriting something after you've written a rough draft of your script.
Yeah.
Let's tackle these highlights. The HDR palette I love for tame back highlights because it actually takes your color gamut into consideration. So it comes with like these 6 little channels. So I can go to like selecting what it thinks the light is. Now, I don't like how when I preview the light, it's picking up the skin. I don't want to mess with
So
the
that's
skin.
what you're doing. You're clicking this
Yep.
just to see.
And it previews what it's targeting.
Yeah, what
so
that
I'm going to
actual-
go to the
yeah.
highlights, and you see how it's like, oh, it's just targeting those, but it's not touching our person.
Versus light versus highlight. Interesting.
Yeah, because if you do primaries, that just takes the whole global image
Yeah.
down,
Yeah.
which is okay if you're trying to do a global effect.
But in HDR, you can get more specific.
Yep. So if I take the highlights and I roll those highlights back a stop, and then I take our speculars, which are even higher, and we roll those back a stop. Once again, I'm not trying to bring them down to a 70 IRE. It's like if you see from our A cam, those windows are still like
Pretty bright.
they're still pretty bright. I just want them to live in a, hey, this isn't nuclear, this isn't distracting.
Yeah.
And by doing that, I
Yeah.
think we're getting closer to that world.
You know what it also does too is if you A/B it there, go to the. This feels like a more I'll call it a more affordable camera. The more you can retain your highlights, the more similar it is to that filmic look, which film in general can really handle a lot of highlights. So that's why for me, when I'm doing my cinematography on set, I'm always protecting my highlights.
Yes.
And I know a lot of people will protect the shadows, so they have that more detail. But I find the second I'm letting everything blow out, that I've made that decision for post already, I'd rather make that decision later on.
Especially with a digital sensor, a lot of these cameras, they don't have pleasing highlights when they get clipped. So another good kind of rule I use for highlights when I'm grading or even exposing is check your log image. If you're saving the information in your log image, you know that you can get it back there. So if I do log to here, notice how the highlights they're not
really
different.
changing. Yeah.
So, but if you're looking to pull those back more, it's like, well, your log image is still this. Yeah. So if I look at the log image and I'm like, oh, I wish I could see the sky through there. Well, the sky's not there in my log image, so there doesn't exist there doesn't exist basically a primary or a rollback the exposure to get like that information isn't there. So I think this is sitting in a good place of bringing those highlights of like where we were on the day.
Question that comes up, because I've said this on my channel before, and some people have disagreed with me, is that if this was raw, I know raw doesn't immediately mean that you have more latitude or more dynamic range, but generally speaking, if this was raw, we would probably have more opportunity and more information to pull from those highlights.
For sure. RAW is a great way of getting that flexibility. Depending on what your post workflow is, if you're handling it all yourself, RAW is great. A lot of times when you're passing off footage, I find RAW can be a bit of a nightmare because there's a little bit more of like making sure all the settings are checked correctly. And if you're passing off the footage, or if you're like, my colorist will do it, and you know, there is some funny things that can happen with RAW footage. But I think ProRes 422, like these are all great flexible codecs.
Great.
Now. So I'm sitting in a good place here. So now let's start talking about white balance. So the Aria is definitely coming in a little more, let's call it neutral warm, whereas the Sony's like...
I'm just... Ari color science is the best. It's so good.
It's usually what we I mean, if you ever download a LUT pack, it's usually like whatever your camera is to the RE. Like that's like the gold standard.
They've nailed it.
Yeah. So if I bring up my vector scope, that's a good way of kind of seeing global color shifts. So you can even kind of see that like our Sony's sitting like more in the cooler blue range, and then when I do a wipe to the Alexa, it's just more central to a bit more warm. Like it's just riding along that line of like probably what you would want from like, we're seeing the sun, it's a daytime interior.
Yeah.
If that hard light wasn't there, maybe it could be more of an Ozarky, maybe like a little more bluey, but like this is probably calling for something a little more warm. So I'm gonna take a node and I'm gonna put it down as my white balance. So usually what I like to do with my white balance is in primaries, I like the offset because that's kind of like your global change colors across the entire board. So
it's a great place to start.
Yeah. And then you can get into the primaries, but like we're gonna start looking at the vector scope. We're gonna start moving it.
Already, I can just see right away, without even having to wipe, it's starting to feel like the Alexa.
Yeah.
And it's obviously very evident based on the vector scope, but you can already feel that.
Yeah, so we're moving that so that like our information is coming more along the line of the Alexa, and it's already looking...
That's why getting used to your scopes is so important, so that you're not just eyeballing things. Eyeballing is important, but the scope will give you the actual raw data that you're knowing if you're actually within the ballpark.
Yeah, so I'm feeling pretty good with this. The next thing I want to tackle is saturation and skin tone, and then we can circle back on things. So when we added all of this contrast in our primary with our kind of S curve here, whenever you increase contrast, your saturation goes up
Yep.
too. The two are forever intimately connected. Increase contrast, saturation goes up, and
Yep.
you have to learn to kind of battle that. So I usually like to work in a separate node so that you know what's doing what and you can control it. So we'll add another node and we'll label this one saturation. And that way, you just know, like, if anything's ever looking funny, if you're ever like, the skin's too red or the greens are too video-ish looking, you're not having to, like, find in your chain, well, where was the problem with that? So let's try pulling it back to, like, let's say 43. And then we'll kind of see that, like, we're just dialing it back like that, and we're doing our wipe, and it's getting closer and closer. Like, we're living in a world where if I was watching this, I'm not like, oh, I'm getting completely taken out of it.
Yeah, there's still, I would, just by eyeballing it, there's still a bit of that Sony cyan, or at least with the, I think that's more so the Helios introduces a bit of that. So it's like, it almost like we want to just get a little bit of that purple out of it.
Yeah, and then so what you can do is go to your parade and kind of see, like, a lot of that, like, purpley cyan is probably sitting in the low end to me. So if I look at the ARI and you look at the bottom, you can see that, like, the blue, green, red, like, these channels are all pretty matched. And then when you come over to the Sony, we might be a little lifted in our blue channel here. So I'm just curious
That's very interesting.
if we take this and we roll that back, if we can neutralize, like, some of that kind of, like, almost evil magenta-y leak in. So if we take this and we almost do that at, like, 60% opacity, if we're just taking kind of those weird blueies and neutralizing them there, we'll label that shadow balance. And then I want to adjust skin for a sec. So my favorite way to adjust skin is our hue versus hue curves. So once again, I think there's just, like, a little bit of red happening there. So we'll just kind of, like, pull down on our red to shift that just so it's, like, sitting more along that, like, almost orangey line. So you can see how we're, like, some of that, like, more video-ish magenta stuff seeps in. Kind of ever so slightly sucking that out. That feels good. And then probably what I'm gonna do is increase global contrast overall, just to really get that face matching, and then I'll probably have to vignette and pull this down. So back in our primaries, we can play with the global contrast here. And then probably, so the way your pivot works is you get to pick where in your waveform that the contrast kind of, like, has its center point. So the lower you go, the brighter it's going to be. So if we set it around 3, that means we're at about 300 IRE in our Rec 709 space. And then if you start crunching it up, raise it up.
It's a great song by Slum Village.
Raise it up. Raise it up.
I'm going to go into my log wheels and I'm going to target just that low end so that the blacks aren't quite as milky. So I'm going to bring those back down. All right. And then we're going to take a vignette and tame down some of these highlights with our B cam because we're locked off. So under kind of our shape tool here, if you click on this here, it targets what's outside, and then a Shift H will kind of show you what you're affecting here. And then what I'm going to do is just take my primary wheel and pull the highlights back a bit, just so it takes the attention.
This is looking fantastic.
It's definitely coming along. And then we're going to do an outside node. And I'm just going to target raising the center just a hair to kind of match our RE. And then I still feel like there's a little too much cool. Like the skin's looking pretty good, but there's just too much cool happening in the low end. So I'm gonna try to neutralize that.
You're running out of node space, not really.
You can always clean it up. So CST is still sitting at the end there.
You just did a cleanup of the nodes.
Yeah, so if you right click on your graph there,
Yeah.
and usually if you give it enough space, it'll go back to either like, it'll just put them back in order.
Yeah. It's very close now.
It's very close. You might almost want to start messing with the RE footage to get it into the world of the Sony.
Yeah.
But
For now, this would cut.
this would cut and is a great starting place. So you can kind of see how, you know, working backwards with a different codec, you're almost like, as long as you have that reference that you're working towards, and you know what the tools are doing, you can almost be like, well, we can get there, because from our starting point, we're so far off from the RE, and you can see where like simple things like the primary, like
Yeah.
really like the big steps of matching contrast and pivot and everything, and then working backwards to be like, that feels too saturated in the skin, so let's take saturation back. And like, if you go on your chain of command, like you can get in a place where it's like, okay, this will cut.
Wow. So there you go. You can see that Nick first started with contrast levels and then slowly moved into your saturation and shadow balance. And then from there, it's just referencing your vector scope and your RGB parade to know, are they actually matching? Are they in the same world? As much as it is about a bit about eyeballing, there is some of that of actually feeling it out and then also getting the actual data.
Yeah, so I would say like use your image wipe at the end and be like, if I was watching this on television, are we in a very similar world? And once you're like, we're in a similar world, if you've pushed your kind of lesser codec as far as it'll go, that's when you might start revisiting your A camera and start being like, well, you know, this is going to start falling apart if we push it much further. So let's go in, vignette this down, and inject a little of that cool.
And in this case, 422 FX6 has a little less information, so we'd then start tweaking the Alexa, which is 444 ProRes, a little more information to work with.
Yeah, but I'm pretty satisfied with like, this would be something that would cut from what is a pretty different starting place with different lens, different color science, like very lifted blacks to different skin tones, different green tones, you know, highlights on the hot end to like, oh, well, this can sit in a more cinematic and I don't feel out of place with the RE world.
Exactly.